World History Discussions, Chapter 6, Part 2. Now we're going to get into some real history, but we're going to start at the very beginning. As you can see, we're doing the history of Central America. So at the height of the last ice age, sea levels were 984 feet lower than they are today, or almost 1,000 feet lower. By the way, if you melted all the ice and peak global warming, the seas would rise another 100 or so feet, which would devastate places like Florida. But it's amazing that they used to be 1,000 feet lower than they are now at the peak of the last ice age. And this, of course, exposed the land bridges, and the Bering Land Bridge connected Russia and Alaska. The main wave of migration probably happened around 15,000 BCE. However, small numbers of migrants may have crossed the land bridge earlier. Some may have also come from Northeast Asia by boat to the west coast of North America, floating on the currents that mostly flow that direction. But anyway, after 15,000 BCE, migrants arrived in large numbers, and by 9,500 BCE, they had reached the southern tip of South America. That sounds like a long period of time, but think about it. 5,500 years to get from the Bering Land Bridge all the way to the southern tip of South America. You know it was 5,500 years ago? The first writing and the first civilization in Egypt and the Near East. Yep, the entire period that we're studying in these world history chapters is about 5,500 years, and that's how long it took from 15,000 to 9,500 BCE for the migrants to migrate from Siberia all through the Americas to the southern tip of South America. I know we talked about that earlier, but anyway, we talked about that way back in Chapter 1 on prehistory. But basically, it was a gradual process to people North and South America. By 7,500 BCE, many large animals were becoming extinct, mostly due to a warming climate, but also possibly and probably due to overhunting, and this led many hunters and gatherers to turn towards fishing and eventually agriculture. The first complex societies in the Western Hemisphere were in this region you're looking at right here on the map, Mesoamerica. Cultivation of maize, or corn, happened around 4,000 BCE, with agricultural villages eventually appearing around 3,000 BCE, and by 2,000 BCE, agriculture had spread all over Mesoamerica. Pretty neat that a completely different part of the world from the Near East also developed agriculture, just did it independently. This is one of the themes I'm going to keep exploring. How is this society similar and yet different from the societies in the Eastern Hemisphere, despite most likely being completely cut off? Well, one way it was definitely different, as we talked about in prehistory, is way fewer domesticated animals in the compared to the Eastern Hemisphere, and therefore there was no need for a wheel. So when we get into stuff like the large stone heads of the Olmecs or the great pyramids of the Mayans and Teotihuacan, remember that the natives of these regions did this with no wheel, which makes it even more impressive than what the people were doing over in the Eastern Hemisphere, where they did have the wheel in the other ancient societies that we studied. So you had these large ceremonial centers that began to appear after about 2000 BCE. But these were not settled societies, and instead they were religious centers where large numbers of people would gather for special occasions, but most would return home at the end of the day, and only priests would live there. And we're going to study the first one of these, which is right there in yellow, the Olmecs Society. And they were at their height from about 1200 to 100 BCE, and most of the other Mesoamerican societies, both the Mayans here and Teotihuacan here, can trace a lot of their culture back to the Olmecs. Also notice the years. The ancient era technically ends in the Eastern Hemisphere and fades into the classical era around 500 BCE, and the Olmecs are the main society here in that era on this side of the world. So pretty much we've almost covered the whole ancient world when we get to the Olmecs, and then we'll be in what's the classical and post-classical era in the Eastern Hemisphere for most of this chapter with the Mayans and Teotihuacan. Olmec civilization, next.